Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Murphy. I'm a senior technical artist on the developer relations team here at Epic Games. And we're going to be discussing top 10 mistakes made by Unity teams when switching to Unreal Engine. Now, I really want to get a few things out of the way first. The first of those is that it's been a long time since I've touched Unity. Not an expert on the subject, never was. So you're probably like, dude, why are you on stage then? And that's fair. The reason I'm here is because I've worked with Epic for the last bit over 8 years now. And during that time, my role has been switching developers over to Unreal and supporting those developers when they do. So for my last 8 years, I've just seen team after team after team switching over, and it's always a fun process. But ultimately, I keep seeing some of the same mistakes within those teams. And because of that, I thought this talk would really be good for me to focus on what those kind of mistakes are. And I want to set some expectations for this talk because I think it's really important to do so. I have no interest in showing you, hey, this button in Unity is this button in Unreal. Not only is that information something that you can grab on YouTube in general, it's also information that is probably going to be wrong in like a year or two's time anyway. You know what I mean? Just adding more confusion to changing UIs and things between the two, feature support between the two, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure general marketing has done a good enough job of filling you in on certain kinds of features that are out there. I'm not really interested in focusing on that. What I am focused on today is more of team changes that occur, design philosophies, what is okay to test the water temperature of with Unreal versus what's not. You know what I mean? And kind of those broader things that surround what conversion really looks like. Because as I said, I keep seeing mistakes, and the truth is when you switch engine, there will be some mistakes. It's a certain level of inevitability. You will always have a bunch of stuff going wrong, and I know that's a terrible way to start this talk, where I'm like, so your switch is going to go problematic. But the truth is for all of the stuff that does go wrong when you're converting and you're switching a UE, there's a lot of stuff that goes right as well. And that's why for today, I really wanted to kind of break down the team dynamics surrounding that. And ultimately, these mistakes, these successes that you have, the amusing anecdotes that your team is going to develop from different parts of that switch, and all of the discoveries that accompany that, they can inadvertently help other team members. Anything that you encounter that is a point of friction, anything that you encounter that is a success, anything that you encounter that is a weird quirk, is definitely something that you want to share. So I kind of wanted to start with just what is team communication when adjusting, and what are the kinds of things that you really want to focus on. And the first of those is, turns out there's a project setting that does X. When you see something like that, when you find a setting, when you realize that there's a hint of some sort of feature, having a Slack channel, Discord channel, or whatever your team's method of communication is to start these things going on, it's not a bad idea to have a general channel where you're kind of just feeding conversation for some of these things, because ultimately you want to build a culture of investigating some of these things further. If you see the hint of something interesting that you've literally never heard about, just kind of sitting in there within Unreal, you really want to try your best to kind of build a culture of investigating further into the engine to kind of help other people know what's there. Because there's a lot of really strange features kind of tucked away in UE, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but having the starting points so you can begin to kind of know what you don't know is really important. Same thing, I found a blueprint node that does this. there are some weird ones. There are some really, really weird blueprint nodes that we have. Same thing with material nodes, because quite often if we needed to do something in Fortnite or in Paragon or whatever project it was, we've had to come up with that. And if there was a good reason for us to generalize that, we did. So in Blueprint, there's nodes for correctly working out the projectile launch velocity to land a character at another location. Based on how fast you're willing to move them, it'll determine the direction and arc, as an example. And that wasn't actually set up for launching characters. That was set up for launching projectiles, because I think that logic in the engine stems all the way back to like Gears of War, I think, of like, how do we land a grenade at this location that you're aiming at? You know what I mean? So like, there's a lot of kind of like weird things like that kind of pop up, and like, again, sharing that information for other people to know about and share further, and just generally building that base is really, really important. Same thing with material nodes. Like, a great example is interior cube mapping. So if you have a surface in Unreal that you want to make it look like there's an office space behind the wall, but you don't want to make the office space, you just want to share a cube map, that's literally one node called interior mapping. And I'm not bringing this up with the audience here to flex. It's more of, I'm bringing this up from the perspective of just, I've seen so many devs shift over to UE that have then written the logic for that node themselves, purely because that never occurred to them that something that seemingly specific was there, that it would be something they could kind of tinker with. This is another one that happens a lot. And, like, turns out this matters in Unreal. Weird. Like, at the end of the day, Unreal is a game engine built to do a bunch of things, and sometimes there are some quirks in which settings that something may or may not have compatibility with. Might be quirks between, does this work? Yes, but not if it has a distance field applied to it, or things like that. But again, kind of like surfacing that information is something I really, really want to stress, that folks kind of are sharing with each other. But the big one I really kind of want to delve into is, I don't think you can do Z in Unreal. Awkwardly, I said X and Y, and then we got to Z, and as an Australian, I know everyone's looking at me weird. You can see Team Z over here. But yeah, like you might be right. Maybe you can't do that in Unreal. But the truth is you also might be wrong. And actually surfacing that kind of thing can inspire other people in the team to double check that. And I bring that up because of that level of like fact checking that kind of needs to occur. Because when you run into that aspect of like, I don't think you can do this feature in Unreal, honestly, your first question should be, did Epic do it in Fortnite? Did they do it in Paragon? Did they do it in Unreal Tournament? Maybe not actually, did they do it in Jazz Jackrabbit? But like, to some level, you've got to be like, have we had to do it conceptually? Because it's pretty weird to have a feature that you're like, Epic's never had to touch that in any of their existing projects, especially since when I say, did they do it in Fortnite, I now mean, did they do it in Lego Fortnite? Did they do it in Fortnite Festival? Did they do it in Battle Royale, or even ye old Save the World? You know what I mean? There are plenty of these problems that we've had to tackle before, and as much as possible, we try and genericize these kinds of solutions. So keeping that in mind is often the first thing of being like, actually, maybe they didn't. Maybe they did, and maybe it has a different design pattern in this space. Because like the next question, is this a thing that people might normally want to do? Because seriously, there's a really good chance that whatever it is that you're looking at is in there in some capacity. There's just a very good chance that the design language between Unity and Unreal might not match in that particular way. Abstracting your language and search terms and such can definitely weigh into it. But like, I cannot stress enough that the number of times a poor Google search because of terminology mismatch between the two on something has resulted in someone spending time writing something, or alternatively, expectation of something not being there has resulted in someone developing a feature that was just something that we generally supported. Because the next thing I want to touch on here is, could an engineer have thought that maybe something that you're looking to do was a good idea? Because another quirk in UE is the source code is accessible. You can read what's there, and you can recompile the engine as necessary. And all too often, you'll find stubs in that source code the engineers often will leave comments like, this would be a good area to extend into this. You know what I mean? Finding the stubs of the source code that seems to be most related to what it is that you're looking at tackling as an engine feature, and actually just reading through what's there for comments. And like, don't get me wrong, I know that that's kind of weird that I'm like, have you considered consulting the several million lines of code? But it is a constantly emerging piece of tech, right? And as a constantly emerging piece of tech, there's quite a few things that, we're not necessarily going to have docs that say explicitly, if one day someone actually wants to do this thing, which is a little left field, however, an engineer often will have a single line or two that's like, suggest extending this function, et cetera, et cetera. The flip side of that is the source code notes that just say @ fix me. And you're like, But this is the other really fun one here, which is, could a random person have thought that maybe someone else might want to do it? Because for the folks out there that are new to Unreal, you may not be aware of pull requests. So if you want, you can do pull requests, which is you can make a change to the source code, and you're like, hey, the engine couldn't do that thing, but it can now. And you can actually suggest that code is taken back by Epic, and we push it to everyone else. But the interesting part of that is sometimes that code, if you're pushing it up there, it's public, right? So if you are doing an engine pull request, you can also then be like, hey, I can see this other person change the engine to do this, and I might actually just want to accept their change and pull their change across into my build. So quite often you'll see things that other folks have done that is advantageous for your project. And sometimes we won't accept a pull request because maybe the pull request adds the feature, but it breaks a whole bunch of other features in the process. But at the same time, if that happens to align with what you're doing, there might be some sort of synergy there, But ultimately, when it comes to this statement, when it does pop up, is I can't help but stress discussing it and validating it. Because you might totally be right. I'm not up here to be like, hey, we're answering all of your problems. But I do definitely want to flag that immediately discounting something in Engine can quite often be something that can catch people off guard. And one person being wrong in basically any of the questions that I brought up before, but someone confidently wrong can really waste a lot of time for a team. And I know you're not actually going to forget your team, but I think too many folks look at switching from Unity to Unreal as just a straight technology change. There is a switch involved, but a big part of that switch is that a lot of your roles end up looking a little bit different. And knowing how to embrace that and knowing how to manage that is a really, really important part of that. Because as I said before, the big issue in switching is not knowing how to use the UI. The big issue in switching is not knowing how to apply materials in Unreal. The big issues with switching, in my opinion, is how are you able to make the most of the talent that you've got so that they're getting the most out of actually having switched to Unreal from a conceptual level to begin with, So how can those rules potentially look different? And this could be a completely different slide with a bunch of different texts suitable to your teams. But great examples of this are, I frequently see designers moving into Unreal, and when they start switching into Unreal, they start embracing Blueprint. They start building their own little systems, they start building their own little tools, they start building their own little modes. But the number of people I know who were designers in a very strict conceptual sense that then had that little bit of extra of actually I can kind of start to make little elements in here that weren't necessarily something that they're originally comfortable with when they were dealing with straight script, And of course, extending that, we have a system that I'll bring up a few times throughout this presentation called the gameplay ability system. But implementing ideas through the gameplay ability system, which is it's a really, really powerful system that gives some level of constraints to designers to build in without breaking too much. Really powerful. Tech artists, when they switch to UE, they have to move between blueprints, materials, control rig, PCG, and whatever other system we've really got in the next release. But they end up kind of shuffling between all these things. The big advantage that I can bring up to you is Epic does build its own tools across the board, right? And I bring that up because there's a reasonably common design language and development language between those tools. So even though our procedural content system was made recently, and our material editor goes back to, I want to say 2006, which means 18 years of development time going on that. As an Australian, that means the material editor in my country can legally drink. But when it comes to those kind of things, there's a reasonably common design language going on between them, and that's not as scary of a thing as it seems. In fact, it means that a lot of the times when you start getting a good head around Blueprint, all of a sudden Niagara makes a little bit more sense, and you start getting a head around materials, PCG might make a little more sense. Even our audio system, Metasounds, which I probably should have had there. But another big job for tech artists that they start needing to embrace, especially as you start pushing towards release, is concepts like device profiles. So managing device profiles, texture groups, and other art pipeline elements. For anyone switching into UE for the first time, we have a whole lot of systems that are in there to do things like this texture is a world diffuse map, whereas this texture is a character diffuse map. And under the hood, we can say, look, if you're pushing out to iPhone, drop all of the character information to 2048, but drop all world textures down to no higher than 1024. Do you know what I mean? So like the tech artist kind of managing some of that pipeline and ensuring that there's consistency there. And again, also doing things like leveraging Blueprint for your framework setups so that you can, your import framework setups, so that that's all managed. On the animation side of things, this is one that we see quite often as well, is because Blueprint's pretty accessible, and Blueprint extends through all sorts of areas of Unreal. With reasonably high frequency, we see animators not only just doing the animation, but they start to engage more in how those animations blend with one another. They start to engage with the notifiers and the states and those little extra bits and pieces. And I gotta tell you that like the advantage of an animator, both doing the implementation and the animations themselves, they know how those things were kind of meant to vibe with one another, right? So the more they're able to actually be in control of how these things sit with one another, the better. But encouraging that is important. Artists, I bring up as well because, they start working with blueprints, but they also start working with level instances. Within UE5, a really big way of developing that we've seen strongly, we've been encouraging, but we've seen strongly taking off, has been leveraging level instances as something closer to the prefabs that you may be used to. Whereas a blueprint is an actor in the world that can have a whole bunch of logic for it. Level instances are micro levels that can be modified and placed within the world again and again and again, and then they can be sampled in our procedural content system. But that can be a really, really powerful approach for world building, and it's something that artists, their workflow changes a little bit there as well. I also want to point out as well that as of 5.5, we have level instance overrides. So you can have a level instance of like a guard tower, for instance. I don't know why I pointed at these three as the guard tower. But you can have a level instance of a guard tower, and then when you drop that guard tower elsewhere in the world, you could rip out the doors on the other one, change the colors on it and whatnot, and it kind of becomes its own little micro level that has those variations stored within it. But you can kind of use them as like a simple templating process for development. And the last one here is programmers. And honestly, one of the big differences that I see for successful switches is programmers mentoring new staff as their roles change. Because you'll notice that I use the word blueprint a lot when we're going through how some of those other roles can change. But honestly, programmers having that mentoring level, and to some extent code reviews, having a gentle check-in with your designers who are making their own tools and being like, hey, I can see you've been doing this. Maybe take this approach next time because you're doing a bunch of things that aren't particularly performant, or you could have taken this approach. But making sure that there's some sort of nice guidance going on to kind of manage that, I think is pretty important. And outside of that, programmers have their own extensions and changes that can kind of occur. So they're actually having to work within the framework and understand the framework and develop on top of it. But I can't stress enough that like the programmer role in Unreal being one where quite often you end up doing underlying architecture, especially in C++, and base classes of blueprints, and then allowing other parts of the team to kind of expand upon those elements is a little bit of a shift, especially if your programmers are used to being like, anything that is interactive in the world was my domain. You know what I mean? Like having that shift from being systems design to, from being everything to systems design and then facilitating the rest of your team can be a change. And again, that's not a necessary one. You can stick to the programmers having complete oversight on all of those things for sure. But it is something that we do see powerful. Now, the other thing that I want to point out for any folks that are in the process of switching right now is ultimately, look, I'm going to bring up GameMaker, I'm going to bring up Godot, Unreal, Unity, whatever, game engines, right? But ultimately, there's so many people who are like, switching is going to be painful because I know Unity and I don't know Unreal. But like the truth is like 80% of what you've been doing is knowing Unity. Sorry, 80% is game development rules and like 20% of it is knowing Unity. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know the flavor of game development that is this thing. And like a weird part is like when switching to UE, quite often the stuff that you know, you're like, oh, the framework actually makes sense to me because I've had to build this before. Like, and bringing that familiarity across is important. And ultimately, the other thing that I want to bring up with this is like when it does come to conversions, like you can trust your team to learn something new. Like that's how they got, why you hired them to begin with. But really what they don't know, that I think that communication side of things that I wanted to stress on, is really understanding what broad headings and what things to kind of pull on so they can start to understand what's best to learn. Because if you don't know what you have in your tool belt, you don't know what you can readily do. And we see this frequently, right? Like animators not knowing about blend space assets or notifies or animation analysis or motion matching just makes their job harder. Animation analysis, for anyone that's unaware of it, is cool. You can bring in like a run cycle, and Unreal can analyze how quick your feet are moving and then correctly put the run at the correct speed and the walk at the correct speed so that as you're running through the world, your feet don't slide by default. Tech artists not knowing about custom import pipeline frameworks like Interchange. So if you're a tech artist on your team, it's really important that they know about things like that, because you can set up import pipelines that say, hey, look, this person just tried to import a model, and that model is from a folder called weapons. And if it's in the weapons folder, I actually want to only give them these pop-ups that says, what's this applied to? What characteristics do you want? And then it can go ahead and automatically create a blueprint or whatever you need and add extra data to it, you know. But facilitating and that development and reducing friction is important. VFX artists quite often don't know about Niagara sim stages or custom fog materials. Shameless self-promotion here, but tomorrow I do have a talk on simulation stages and other fun Niagara topics. It's pretty advanced, but it's good stuff. Audio engineers, not knowing about procedural audio systems. So we have Soundscape in there for handling large-scale procedural audio in the world. It's actually what we use in like The Matrix Awakens, so that as you move through the world, it's generating all the traffic noises and crowd noises. But also it does that when you're all the way up in the air, so that when you instantly drop down to the ground, those noises are already going on. They don't like fade in because you've started to go into that area. And that's all run off of tag data too. Programmers coming in and not knowing about the game playability system or an engine source code is the other really big one that is really worth flagging, because that really does change what a programmer is able to achieve. And I really want to talk about source code, because Unreal gives you access to the source code, as I mentioned before, and there are a bunch of reasons to leverage it. Like fixing engine bugs is a great example. Like bugs are always going to appear. That's just the state of it, you know, like any engine you get, any release you get, something's going to go wrong somewhere, right? And what we strongly suggest for a lot of teams as you're developing is, as much as possible, stick with Unreal's versioning. And then as you get closer and closer to release, at some point you consider, hey, I don't want to switch to 5.6 or I don't want to switch to 5.7. And instead what you can do is stick with what you've got. But if there is a bug, you can look into the source code of future versions of Unreal or main, and you can pull the change list for that specific bug fix. I was about to say that specific bug. A specific bug fix, and pull that logic back into your own build. Does that make sense? So like the ability to be like, look, I can see you've got fancy stuff here, but really what I want to do is not crash on this particular console, you know? And kind of like micro-handling that. Extending engine behavior. So if you feel like the engine comes close, but it's not quite there, you can add to it, you can extend it. But make sure that when you're doing it, you're really carefully listing where you've made changes. Because when you do migrate up your engine version, you're going to need to bring those changes back over. Adding more debug information is another common one where, if you can't kind of track down where something's occurring, going into that side of things can really help clarify where a bug is, where a headache is, where an issue is. But at the same time as there's a bunch of reasons to change it, there's also a bunch of reasons to stay away from modifying it. And this is pretty common too. So my first question is, do you have processes and source control set up to manage an engine build? If you're changing the source of Unreal, do you have a good system around that? Because it's a good idea for any studio that's a bit larger, that's likely to be touching engine source. And again, I want to stress that plenty of people release with just vanilla Unreal builds. This isn't essential, but it is pretty common for as teams get larger and more selective about what they want to do. But if a new update comes along, do you have a way to handle it? Do you have a good way to and processes to kind of switch over? The next one is, are you going too far off the beaten path? This catches a lot of teams off guard. Because if you do start modifying the engine source code, let's say you're like, all right, you guys have done a great job, but I hate this chunk of your renderer. I feel like rewriting that. First off, good luck to you. But secondly, the problem you get is that when you make a bunch of those changes, the more you deviate from Unreal, the more you're ending up in a situation where it's like, well, the next build is going to be harder and harder and harder to migrate to, because you have to bring all of those changes with you. So really understanding if you're doing that kind of thing, what are the ramifications of doing so, and trying your best to keep it there. Because quite often I've seen these kind of changes get made where someone was like, I'm going to make a quality of life change. And they kind of went all in over the course of a weekend. And when they came up for air on the other side, what they had actually done is made the build more and more difficult for them to kind of manage as things went forward. So the cost trade-off there of, do you want to more easily be able to pull epics changes into what you're doing? And again, I'm not trying to scare you. I just want to stress that is another element. Just finally, do you know what you're doing? If you don't have anyone on the team that's really comfortable with that, it might be a contractor job, but just be aware that when you pull more contractors in, you may need to have that contractor again helping you make the change. So I brought up the gameplay ability system before. GAS, as the cool kids call it, is disabled by default. I bring this up because there's a lot of features that are not on by default, so you don't necessarily know about them. Now, gameplay ability system is a framework for handling abilities, which is a really generic way to describe it. But think of it this way. Let's say you're making a role-playing game and you, shoot someone with a fire arrow. When you do that, you might be taking into account the damage of the arrow, the damage per second that's going on from said fire. You might be taking into account the armor that they've got. You might be taking into account some sort of spell or enchantment or, whatever else, right? But there's a lot of things there that kind of stack on top of each other that could be causing different effects, different particle systems to play, different things for those things to get calculated. GAS is a framework for managing that. And this is one of the systems that I see a lot of devs from Unity kind of building their own version of. They do it first time. And the truth is that GAS is the kind of framework where your first build of that kind of system is not going to work. And then your second build of that kind of system will maybe work, but it'll be that thing where one person on the team kind of knows how it works and everyone else is terrified to touch it because it's held together with string. And everyone just kind of quietly hopes that they don't get hit by a truck throughout development. Because if that were to happen, the team's going to be in a difficult situation, right? And GAS is something that I wanted to bring up because it being a framework in Unreal for handling this type of stuff is really, really, really useful. Because it being in there as something that we can kind of leverage means two things. One, if you're an employee, not the employer right now, I want to flag that you have portability to bring those skills elsewhere. And if you're the employer, I want to flag the other part of that, which is if you're going through development and you realize you need more nerds to handle this side of things, that's great. Because you can hire people who have experience with the gameplay ability system that will already understand the system without it being like a whole lot of onboarding that's really required to kind of wrap your head around it. Do you know what I mean? So that being generalized within the engine, important. The procedural content system that we have that we keep showing off since 5.2, wonderful system, disabled by default. State tree, which is the system that we have in there for AI, again, disabled by default. Landmass, which is a system that we have for drawing splines, and then when you draw a spline, it'll create a mountain or it'll carve out roads or canyons for you. That system, again, is really, really wonderful, disabled by default. The water system, which is really far cooler than most people realize, because not only does the water system let you drop in lakes or rivers or oceans or whatever else, but it also lets you have buoyancy. So a cool thing with the water system is if any of your actors have a buoyancy component, when you drop them in a river, they will float downstream. And I gotta say, as a game dev, the first time I realized that just worked, there was like a single tear. It was beautiful. Like, I know, like, I was impressed when I saw Nanite, but the first time I accidentally saw, like, my own weapon in a game, like, float away from me, I was like, you know? But again, it's disabled by default, right? And, like, I didn't bring this up to, like, be like, haha, you didn't know it. But I do want to flag just that act of getting used to Unreal is also that act of understanding what's there, and that means you got to do a whole lot of exploring. And if you're going to do a whole lot of exploring, let's look at where you need to go. First thing of that is going into project settings. So this contains settings that are relevant to your project settings, which makes sense. So this is stuff that's related to this specific project. Gameplay tags, virtual textures, subtitles, that kind of stuff is generally controlled from here. Editor settings are going to be things that affect all of your projects, because that is your editor on this machine. So things like your hotkeys are here there. Now, I think people think that there is some sort of weird internal like information source where I learn a lot of these like weird tips and tricks. I got an embarrassing admission. The sheer number of features I've discovered in Unreal, because I happened to notice that in the editor settings there was a hotkey for it, and I was like, the hell is that? Well, I've got a career out of it. So like knowing that that's there, really, really powerful. Going through it is really useful. Because I mean, a good example of hotkeys, right, is like there's an entire system in Unreal for handling multiple 2D layers. So if you are making a 2D game, you can just press a single key and it'll flick to the background layer, the foreground layer, or the mid-game layer. You know what I mean? Like having that, but like you wouldn't expect it to be there, but then you see it as a hotkey binding and you're like, what? Plugins. So there's a lot of plugins there. Like I mentioned landmass, I mentioned water, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of stuff that's there. And honestly, just giving that a good scroll through and seeing what's around is really, really useful. If there's no description on them, it probably means that it's a very recent plugin that the engineers have put there, but they're like, eh. And finally, I mentioned the engine source before. So, you know, if it's not in Blueprint, but it still might be somewhere. Having a look through the engine source for what's there can be an interesting trip every now and then, especially if you're like, I need to live inside of this specific system for a while. Knowing what it's doing under the hood is not the worst idea. Now, I mentioned new features before and changes and migrating up engine versions. Ultimately, this is something I really want to stress again, is that like, at some point during development, you don't care about our new features anymore. You care if the new project update, the new engine update that we have, you know, improves your rendering speed, or if it improves latency, or fixes some bugs, or whatever else. But you know, at that point, you're like, dude, we locked down our app pipeline 6 months ago. Stop doing this to me. Now that's fine. But again, the thing that I really want to stress is that grabbing those changes is still encouraged, because the closer you don't break it, that's when you start cherry picking those changes. You know, getting into that situation of like, this is incredibly stable, everything's fine, except apparently on this specific graphics card, this goes wrong. Oh, there's a change for that, and you can grab that. I can't stress enough for new devs, while 5.5 is about to come out, if there's a fix in 5.5, it was available in main on GitHub ever since it was done. Do you know what I mean? Like, we're not hiding these bug fixes from you. They're sitting there. You can grab the code changes as required. So even if 5.5 drops and the day after 5.5 drops, there's a bug fix for something in 5.5, you don't need to wait for, you know, 5.5.2 or 0.1 or point whatever or 5.6. Instead, you can just be like, we need this because we're shipping very soon. And ultimately, getting something out the door, you know, is absolutely paramount, right? Next thing I want to touch on is blueprints versus C++. So this is one of those things that I hate as a topic, because it's never the right way to look at it, in my opinion. Every time you use the word versus between Blueprint and C++, you're doing it wrong. Because ultimately, there's like a relationship between these two things, right? Blueprints, you want to look at for faster creation, faster iteration, better for visualizing flow and how things fit together, and flexible editing. And on the C++ side of things, there is faster performance and explicit design. You've got broader access to different parts of the engine, more control and better control of network replication. Like while Blueprints good for handling certain parts of replication, on the C++ side, you can be very explicit with how that's working. And obviously, C++ is easier to diff and merge. But I wanted to bring it up that these things are made to work together. And whenever you are moving those things from from Blueprint to C++, you need to be aware that you're basically saying this chunk of the team is probably not going to have access to it unless they know C++. And that can have development concerns, right? The other thing I will flag is that programmers can use the reflection system that's in Unreal to choose what to expose to the rest of the team. So if you have a base class, you can choose what's going to be accessible within Blueprint when they're doing that, which is kind of effectively, in a way, what the game playability system is. It's a version that exposes the right stuff to the right people and then doesn't give them too much else. They're kind of working within the system you've developed. One thing I want to flag on this is you can use the Blueprint header tool to move classes back to C++. This is really useful. It's tiny. I probably should have put this on a different slide. But how it works is, laser pointer. Basically, as you do stuff in Blueprint, it'll show all of these variables and function declarations and what the C++ header file would look like if you were to create a C++ header. So if you need the C++ declaration because you want to have that as a base class, this is a nice way to start moving code from one to the other. The other thing I'll flag is that you can use class redirects to swap out Blueprint classes for C++ classes. So just because you started something in Blueprint, you can start moving that backwards and redirect as appropriate. Okay? Now, I just really want to hammer back on this point again, is just be aware that premature optimization can reduce the speed with which you iterate. So the number of times I've seen people move stuff from Blueprint to C++, but the truth is their game was running at 25 FPS because of rendering issues that they had and had nothing to do with their Blueprint and C++ is non-zero. So, do you actually need to make that optimization yet? And yeah, as long as it's in Blueprint, there's a good chance it can be distributed across different parts of the team, and that actually can reduce everyone else's workload. So the next thing I want to go into here is don't treat the gameplay framework like it's just a set of guidelines. So we have a framework in Unreal. We have player controllers and AI controllers, which are a good structure that allows bot support, and that means it's easier for debugging. We have pawns and characters in there, which has all sorts of functional benefits under the hood and movement modes and such. But characters give you full bipedal movement and a bunch of other logic, and quite often I see people ignoring characters because they're like, no, but that guy needs to use a grappling hook, so I'm going to ignore all of the other logic and benefits of that, and they write their own system when they could have used character with a custom movement mode. Game modes and game states are set up for handling replication out of the gate, and if you're toying with multiplayer, maybe setting that up and using the framework approach early is a good move, not necessarily rolling your own kind of your own singleton for handling that, but instead kind of rolling with what we've got is a good move. And finally, the camera manager, there's an entire structure in there for handling blends and camera changes, and 5.5 introduces an even cooler update to that, which is very good. I'm not going to go into it because that'd be an entire other hour's talk, but I've seen some really, really, really smart people fight the framework and lose. Don't stuff your AI logic exclusively into your pawns, because they're like, hey, I've got a dude that I want to run around and do all of these things. I don't need to write custom AI for him. I'll put it in the pawn. And then later on, they find out they need to use the pawn or extend it or have variants, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden, it's kind of all problematic. Don't create your own pawn class that doesn't inherit from pawn. This is another one, again, I see from quite a lot of devs that are switching from Unity especially. A pawn, for anyone that's unfamiliar with it, I glossed over due to time constraints, but a pawn is something that can basically accept your inputs and handle movement in a reasonably clean way. And quite often I see people who are like, no, I don't want the fat that is associated with pawn and all of this extra stuff that's in there. I just want to have an actor that's got these extra little bits. There's a chance that that's what you want, but there's a higher chance that just leveraging pawn for other benefits is still pretty useful. If you're not going to use the character class, you should really just think it through first. Having that existing interoperability with a bunch of extra systems that are in there is really important. So looking at how you're going to have your movement systems and such, really, really beneficial. If you need a controller, another thing that happens quite often here is quite often people are putting logic in begin play. So begin play is when you have a blueprint and the game begins and it does this logic and says, hey, X, Y, and Z has to happen here. But often what they actually want to do is not when the game begins, but rather when the game has possessed that character and put the player inside of them as input, or put a bot inside of them as input. You know what I mean? People always think that that's exactly the same time, but sometimes there's a millisecond between those two things and you can break other stuff. So again, thinking about the possession structure that's inside the framework and leveraging that is pretty important. So the last one that I want to bring there is if you're going to write your own ability system, you need to consider the secondary benefits, which is what I mentioned before, is it's a standardized system across a lot of our projects. We use it, and so many licensees use it. So if you really, really want to roll your own ability system, really think about the ramifications of doing so, not just from a oh, hey, my system will support this and this feature, which you kind of have to do in a slightly janky way in the default one. Janky is a technical term. But rather, instead, it's the benefits of having to do the slight jank every now and then means that anyone you ever hire or bring into it knows what's going on, can be beneficial. So the thing that I want to flag here is experience is really what tells you when it's okay to ignore parts of that framework. And I guess while you're still in that early stage, do your best to kind of adhere to it and you'll have a smoother time. There are some things that you can straight out of the gate be like, all right, I'll treat that as a sometimes thing. So game state and player state, which are used for handling data in multiplayer environments, maybe things that you don't really need. But when it comes to things like pawn and controllers and game modes and game states, get on board. So the next thing is understanding when a sample is right for you and when it's important for your project. So city sample is one of the samples that we have, and it's really great for understanding the art pipeline of large worlds. Again, for any of these projects that we have, the other thing that's really useful to browse is our console variables, so our config files that go with them, because you can see all of the differences that we've set up in the graphical options to get something like city sample, what sacrifices have we had to make to lighting to try and get that to update in the way that we do. You know what I mean? So what else is going on under the hood to get that working? Crop out is a really good example of looking at the framework in a slightly non-conventional way, so having a look at how that's handled in a more of an RTS view. Plus it's blueprint only, so how do they handle various things there. Stackerbot is a reasonably clean way of looking at how the implementation of framework fundamentals and blueprint interactions go together. So understanding just the very basics and getting in there. As far as I'm concerned, content examples should be pretty much on everyone's machines. Content examples is like a museum-style exhibit that shows you how all of these features are stuck together. Lyra is something I want to bring up because it's really, really advanced. It's very cool. But the truth is in a weird way, it's kind of a framework built on a framework. And if you are switching into Unreal and you don't have any existing Unreal Engine folks, this actually can be very intimidating for newcomers too, in my experience. So as cool as it is, I treat Lyra as how would a team who's made an Unreal game make a second Unreal game? But understanding why Lyra's made a lot of the choices that it has, in my experience, comes from having gone through that once before and being like, okay, they're doing trade-offs for this to get this, or they've set up a system to handle this to get this. It's really, really good, but again, don't think it's necessarily what you have to use. Next piece of advice is keep an eye on Fortnite. Honestly, we keep throwing UE5 features into Fortnite again, and I mean, heck, we threw UE5 into Fortnite, right? It was a UE4 project. And we've turned on Nanite and Lumen, and we're discovering all of these things as we go through. So making sure that you're really keeping in, I swear I'm not just trying to get V-Buck payments out of you all. But understanding what it's doing and what features are coming in and why those are coming in, and how we're taking advantage of them in different ways. This is really important to me because as far as I'm concerned, Fortnite kind of keeps Epic honest. You know what I mean? Like, we're not just like, hey, we've got this feature for you to check out. We're like, hey, we have this feature for you, and we had to use it, and here's how we did it, and that's how all of those players are leveraging that, which systems can and can't run it, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a real-world example again and again and again. But we do our best to have blog posts to go with that. You know, we've had Lumen blog posts, Nanite blog posts, Virtual Shadow Map blog posts, et cetera, et cetera. And like, when you can kind of see what sacrifices and what choices we made for different types of features, it's pretty good. And that's where it comes to dog fooding. So dog fooding is one of those words that I swear every time I use it around marketing, I see someone wince. But straight up, you don't know how the dog food tastes unless you eat it. And you know, we're making games while we're making the engine. And tragically, that means we have to taste it reasonably often, you know. But at the same time, you know, it really does mean that we are testing these things out. And if you have concerns about the stability of a feature, sometimes just being like, look, is it being used in Fortnite right now? Because that'll give you a good idea of like how many devices are currently testing out that new feature that came in reasonably, you know, recently. But understanding like when we've been using it in a product is pretty beneficial. And again, like I want to stress that Fortnite is not just Fortnite. Like there's all of those other modes. Like Lego Fortnite is testing out. Like it means that we can see things like large world coordinates and things like that might be valuable in Lego Fortnite, or the instance actor plugin that we have. You know, like it's getting tested in different ways. Now, the last thing I want to touch on here is community, because a pretty frequent thing that I'm sure there's at least a couple of people have done in this room is like they decide to do their prototype in Unity. I can see like 5 people just immediately turn to the person next to them as I said that. Busted. But like, you know, you decide to do your prototype in Unity and then you're like, oh, but we'll do full production in Unreal. But the problem is when you do that, you end up in that situation where you're all cloak and dagger and you're no longer actually talking about the project that you're building because, yeah. And that ends up being a situation where, you know, you have it's a little bit harder to get input into your project because you now kind of don't want people to know what you're making. And that's tricky because ultimately when you're switching engines, engaging your community matters. So like it matters for finding your talent, it matters for validating ideas and concepts, it matters for staying generally out of your echo chamber. But I wanted to bring it up because engaging in things like meetups is really powerful. Many cities have Unreal Engine meetups that you can get involved with, and you can meet people, and you can, you know, discover new things, frequent talks. It kind of varies between cities. Some cities have a talk every month, and then other cities they gather for drinks and discussion. Unreal Fests, obviously you know about those, but to the people who watch this one day on YouTube, you should come. There's free seats. And the Unreal Engine developer community, so the EDC, this is really powerful. This is just the dev community that we have. A lot of people don't realize that it's not just a forum, but you can post entire tutorials up there, but also snippets. So you can actually copy and paste blueprint graphs and material graphs into the website, and then you can copy them out of the website again, and you can share snippets with each other. Also, pro tip for all of you, you can copy and paste things from You can copy and paste your material graph. I don't know why you specifically, but you can copy and paste your material graph into Slack and then out of Slack, or into Notepad and out of Notepad. Unreal actually converts them to plain text and then back again, which is really useful. So, as I said, let's do a quick recap on the top 10 mistakes. We've got not communicating well about the successes and failures of switching, not embracing the slight changes in team roles that may be there, ignoring source code, not exploring features that are disabled by default, not rolling with engine changes where you can, ignoring Blueprint or C++, just generally fighting the framework, not leveraging samples, not keeping an eye on how the engine is evolving and being used, and not getting involved in the community. But that is a really, really bad way to finish this talk. Because I don't want to get here and be like, shake my finger at you a whole bunch and then tell you to leave. So instead, let's go with top 10 nuggets of wisdom and let's reword that one. So communicate about what's working and what's not. Discuss it, investigate it, and where possible, make sure that you're surfacing information within your team again and again and again. Embracing that team growth. So if your animator is interested in trying to handle the animation blending themselves, they don't want to throw it off to the domain of a programmer or another person on the team, it's great to get them involved. You should let them, just make sure they've got oversight and assistance as they do it. Consider your source code. So whether it's changing the engine, extending the engine, or simply learning from it, because that's a part that I didn't discuss before, is really just any blueprint node. If you've got the source code there, you can double click on it and see what that blueprint is doing in C++. So you have constant examples of how to achieve things in the C++ side of the engine by looking at how we handle all sorts of other functions. Snoop through the engine, find out what you don't know. Roll with engine changes, because we're fixing things, we're fixing them for you. So the more you're able to kind of just get those changes, the better. Get the most out of Blueprint in C++ and treat them as symbiotic. Treat them as things that are meant to work together for the team to function accurately. Where possible, make the framework fight for you. So where possible, you really want to make sure that you're building off of our game states, our game modes, our pawns, our characters, our camera classes, and everything else that goes with it, and not rolling your own solutions. It's really, I know that sounds weird for me to keep bringing that up, but I've seen it so many times of people rolling their own solutions for stuff that's in there, and it's pretty rare that that's really paid off. Embracing the samples and knowing what they're there for, because you really want to make sure that you want to know what the samples are, if anything, to also make sure that when a team member asks you a question, you can tell them to look at the right samples. Having a broad knowledge of what's there and available. And actually, one thing that's kind of worth noting here is also that UE4 samples, there's a very high chance that those are still very relevant to your UE5 needs. Action RPG is how to use the game playability system in a rather simple way for a single-player RPG game, right? It's a UE4 sample. It's deprecated now, but you can still investigate it and look through it. It is in our samples section, except the latest version it runs in is 4.27. Keep an eye on what's going on. So we're fixing workflow issues for Fortnite all the time. Let's fix yours too. And, join the community, make some friends, get some outside perspective, and build from there. So I hope this was useful. I know we went through a lot of stuff there pretty quickly, but I hope this has been useful. I'm looking forward to seeing you around the rest of Fest. I think we've only got a couple of minutes left, but yeah, thank you all very much for your time. Apologies for the jet lag, but hopefully it was useful.